Awesome. Thank you, Yasmina. Like I was said, like she said, I'm Juhis. Super happy to be here talking to you today. And I really also wish that I could have been there in Stockholm with you. Originally, I was planning to be there in April doing this talk in person. And I hope that once the situation gets better, we can maybe go for a fika together when I come visit Stockholm. But today I wanted to talk about documentation. It's something that throughout my career I've noticed more and more all the time. It's something that we as software developers are not always that good at. And it's one of those things where even if we are good at it, it gets kind of deprioritized. It's among things like testing, where it happens if there's time. And today I wanted to talk about documentation from a perspective and kind of hoping to give you really practical things that you can do still this week when you get back to work. So you don't have to re-envision everything and change everything you do, but you can make small adjustments and small improvements to get better at the documentation that you do in your project. And let's see if I can get the technology to work. So, I've decided to take this point of view of contemporary documentation. And it's not something that's kind of well defined, because I just kind of came up with the term when I was thinking about documentation. So let's start by some definitions. First of all, if we look at the dictionary, we can see that contemporary can mean two different things. And it's something that kind of, those two definitions cover almost everything. It covers the past and the present. And today, we are only focused and interested in the first definition. We are interested in learning how we can capture the moments in history as they happen inside the documentation. As the presentation goes on, you will understand a little bit better what that means. So a little bit of background on me. I'm Juhis from Helsinki. So I work at Futuris at the other side of the sea here in Helsinki. And I work as a developer advocate, which means that during these special times, it's been quite a different time. I normally host a lot of meetups. I go to a lot of conferences, meetups, meet a lot of developers. So these past 8 months have been quite an interesting approach of new kind of thinking into what it could mean. And as a hobby, I also run a developer community, pretty much like the Stockholm.js. It's called Turkulats Frontend. We've been in operation for almost 5 years now. We run monthly meetups, just like you do here. And the reason why I really want to talk about this, and the reason I think that you should listen to me when I talk about this, is that I have a background of being a developer, both as an independent contractor, as a software consultant at Futuris, and also in fast-growing startups in Silicon Valley and here in the Nordics. And throughout all of those, I've noticed one thing that's common, and that is that teams change. New people come in, old people leave. And when I've been doing this talk in person, I've asked people to raise their hand if they are working in a project and they've been on that project for 2 years or more. And there hasn't been any new people coming or any old people leaving. And quite often I only get maybe 1 or 2 hands. Because software as an industry is also something that changes all the time. The average tenure of a career in a single company is about 2 years, which means that in some form is going to be lost. It's going to be the silent knowledge that we lose when old people leave and when new people join, because they don't know about those things. They might not know that they should be asking about them. And the idea with this contemporary documentation is that we're able to capture those things in the history as they happen, so that when we need to look back, we can figure out why certain things were done. And since I'm assuming that the audience is mostly software developers, I'm not gonna do a documentation 101. But I do want to talk about a couple of things. First one is that a good documentation doesn't just document what and how. Some people argue that those shouldn't be documented at all. I don't agree with that. But I think that if we only document the kind of technical things, what does it do? How does it do that? We lose the most important thing and the most difficult thing to figure out afterwards. And that's why. Why was something done this way? Why did they use this library? Why is this line of code here? And there's a good reason for that. And the idea is that most of the documentation we want to keep up to date. Documentation should be a living organism that changes as the software evolves. Nobody wants to see code comments, API docs, or like readmes where the information is not up to date. That's not something that's very valuable to us, because then we run into problems of the documentation doesn't match the code. But there are certain things that if we always just keep updating and updating, we lose some of that history. And I think many of us have probably been in a situation where we're kind of thinking about, why did they do this? Sometimes they is us in the past. But you look at some code and you don't quite understand why certain decisions were made. And that's why we need to capture the history. And in this talk, I want to go through a couple of ways where you don't have to introduce any new tools, anything new to your workflow. You just have to think about things from a little bit different angle and be a little bit more diligent when documenting things. And I've identified 3 branches of contemporary documentation. And if you've been in the industry for a long time, or even just a couple of years, you probably notice that these are familiar tools that you are most likely using. It is possible that some of these you are not using, and that's perfectly fine. You don't have to do all of them to be able to do this and to get value. You just need to do a little bit at a time. 10% increments over time becomes a good code base. These 3 branches use the tooling of version control. And I've been using Git, GitHub, and Jira for most of my years as a developer. So I'm using that terminology. But if you're using something else, feel free to mentally connect these concepts into the ones that you're doing. And the first one is commit messages. Those little bits of information that we use when we document and store a single change. And I will talk about how to use those as documentation. The second one is the code review process. The time when you go through the code with your teammates, you make sure that things are done the right way. And documenting that process is also really important. do want to say that doing these things are not always easy. And they're not easy for us for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that as software developers, we're not really taught to write for other people. We spend our studies writing things for the computer, and we spend most of the time at work writing things for the computer. So writing documentation for other people is a little bit different than just writing things for the computer. And the second reason is that it's psychologically difficult because you don't get an immediate reward. Maybe your team gets the reward in the long run. Maybe it's not even your team. Maybe you work as a consultant and the client decides to switch the team. But being good developers, we want to make sure that anybody who touches the code in the future will be able to figure it out, even if we are not there anymore. So when the reward comes later, or never for us, that makes it difficult to prioritize. It makes it difficult to kind of get into the habit of writing things. So let's start with commit messages. Commit messages is one of the first things you learn when you start using version control. Before you learn all the fancy things, all the specialty tools, you learn to make the commit. And sometimes in the reality, the commit messages start looking like this. At the beginning of the day, beginning of the week, beginning of the project, you're quite diligent. You start writing good commit messages. And as time goes by, maybe there's deadlines looming. Maybe your teammates are expecting something. Maybe it's the client. Maybe it's the product owner. Somebody wants stuff done fast. And maybe you've been hitting your head to the wall for a couple of hours. And when it finally works, you don't have the energy to write really good commit messages. And I'm definitely guilty of this. I think many of us are. That the quality of the commit messages decreases over time. So I'm not telling you that you need to make perfect commit messages all the time. Nobody can do that. But if you try to focus a little bit on making the commit messages better, that's gonna go a long way. And when I think about what to write in the commit message, early in my career, I would just do one-liners. I would use the git commit-m and provide a really small, concise thing. Fixed this issue or added that feature type of thing. But the more I've worked in projects, I've realized that the real question I need to ask is, what would I like to know 2 years from now? Coming back to this code, whether it's me or somebody else. And because we know so much about the code, we've been diving deep into it at the moment of creation. It's sometimes difficult to come up with those things because they're obvious to us. So I like to rephrase it in a way that, what would you ask from a colleague who wrote this code 2 years ago? What are the things that are obvious to you now? What kind of process did you go through? Did you learn something new? Did you figure out something? Or if you made some decisions, what were those decisions? And why did you make them? Capturing the why, like I mentioned earlier, is one of the most difficult things to figure out afterwards. Because even if that colleague is there 2 years from now, they won't remember what they were thinking. Here's one example. This is from a UK government project that showcases an example of a really some really good tools that you can take into your team to make sure that everybody writes good commit messages. But since I promised earlier that you don't need to install any new tools, you don't need to introduce anything new, you can just continue with what you have. You don't need to go back in history. Just from this moment on. Tomorrow you make a commit. Think about that commit a little bit extra. And think about what are the things that would be forgotten. The next aspect is the code review. I personally think that code review is essential for any team that has more than one person working on it. How to do code review? It really differs between teams. It differs between people. I think probably, at least on the projects that I've been working, one of the most common one is to make a pull request on GitHub or GitLab. Then you have your colleagues check it out. They approve. You merge the code. Some people like to sit down and do kind of a pair programming style, walking through the code. And there's a couple of things, regardless of what the way you choose. There's a couple of things that you can do. The first thing is that write all of those things down. Whether you're doing it asynchronously or sitting together with somebody, the discussions that you have with people, the questions that come up, and the discussions that happen, write them down. Because in 2 years, you won't be there, and people won't remember what they discussed. And code review is not a kind of process. It's not a process where a developer showcases what they did and asks for some kind of judgmental. It's a discussion. It's a way for people to learn about the code base, about the changes, and ensure that the quality of the code stays intact. So asking a lot of questions is a really good thing. Asking those questions in a good way is kind of an art itself. But it's always better to ask the questions and document them. And then if you make changes based on those discussions, based on those questions, don't change the history. Don't delete those comments. Leave them there. At least in GitHub, it will kind of hide all the comments and questions that touch a code base that was later changed. So even if something ends up changing, knowing about those discussions can be really valuable down the line. Because you might end up 2 years later having the same discussion, and then at least some multiplication and subtraction and all that good stuff. And there is a comment that says a little bit about that. But I really want to get back in the history to see what kind of things were made. So the first thing I can do is I can use git blame. These are tools that are also these days built in to most of the editors. If you use something like VS Code, some IDEs, you can get these directly from that. But to be a little bit kind of tool agnostic, I'm using the command line tool, and I can find that line. And at the beginning of that line, I can find the commit hash. That tells me where did this commit come in. Sometimes you need to go a little bit like multiple layers back in the history, because there might be some styling changes. Things might have been renamed, so it might not always be the latest thing. Then I go, in this case in GitHub, I put that in the search box, and it gives me the commit for this commit hash. And this is not a particularly good example of a good commit message or good code review. This is just to explain the workflow. So inside the commit, I can now read the commit message. But I can also see which pull request did it come in from. And this is a really nice feature that I love. Being able to walk back into the bigger picture of the code review and the pull request. Because usually there's multiple changes related to the same thing. So we can click that and we can end up at the pull request. If this would be a real pull request, we would be able to see the discussion, the questions, the review, some additional changes. And then I can also mark on the pull request that this fixes a particular issue. And these tools are quite interconnected these days. You can use them really nice and easy. This one uses GitHub issues, so I can just say fixes number 2, and when I click that, I get into the issue. And now I can read the discussion about the origin, the business driver. Why was this needed in the first place? What was the definition of done? And this way, starting from the code, there's one line that I'm hesitant to change because it doesn't look what I expect it to look. And I can go back and I can find all that information that didn't get updated as the documentation was. It didn't get updated in 2 years. The history is still there. So let's recap. Commit messages, code reviews, stories, task issues. They are a really good way to capture the moment in history into something that doesn't change, doesn't get updated, and doesn't get removed. Think about what would you like to know in 2 years. Try to get over the things that are obvious and things that you know because you spent the last week on that piece of code. Try to record all of those things. And lastly, maybe most importantly, write it down. Because in 2 years, you're not going to be there. And even if you are, you won't remember what you were thinking. Anyways, I'm super happy that I got the opportunity to come here and talk with you. You can find me on Twitter at Juha-Matti. I also write a personal blog at juha-matti.org. I post weekly about technology, sometimes about community. I also run a developer newsletter at Futurist called Dev Breakfast. You can find it at hello.futurist.com/dev-breakfast. Every month, one of my colleagues from all around Europe collects a collection of articles, interesting things in the web, to share to software developers like you. I think now we can take a look if there's any questions. I will be looking every now and then to my left
Thank you so much for that presentation. I think it was super interesting, and I really liked the approach to documentation. I think that was super interesting, and I recognize so many of the things you mentioned, I don't see any questions at the moment, so I wonder if does anyone have anything they wonders or anything like that?
And also, if you don't come up with questions now, feel free to tweet at them or send me an email, and I will definitely get back to those. And since there are no questions, I do want to emphasize that making small improvements little by little is something that's going to make a big difference in the end. I think quite often when we read some blog posts or watch conference talks, there's often these kind of big ideas of changing everything and starting from the scratch. And that's definitely something that kind of, it can be a little bit too much to get started with. But now I see that we have some good questions coming up.
Yeah. I can. I can probably read them.
Do you want to ask?
Yeah, or you. I can take the first one. Is it is time best spent documenting code or writing commits? Is there a trade-off between them?
It depends a bit on what you mean by documenting code. I think it doesn't matter that much where the documentation lives. Some documentation is great to be in the code comments. That's also something that's really heated. I'm not gonna go too deep into that. Some people really love code comments, some absolutely hate them. Some of the things I believe are really good there if they document the kind of the bigger picture around that piece of code. A good example for that, unfortunately, it's an NDA project, so I cannot show the example, but I worked in a project where we had this kind of real-life event that was related to different stating code. And in the code base, in the file that touched that base, like that functionality, there was an ASCII flowchart at the top that was going through kind of like, this is the order of different states that it can have. And these are the things, what it means. So if somebody from the business side, essentially a user, comes to us and says that like, hey, when the state is ABC, it should show this kind of thing. Even if we are not domain experts, we can go to that part of the documentation in the code comments, and we can see what does this mean in relation to the code. I think then when it comes to kind of trade-offs, there's always a trade-off, especially on how we use the time. There's never enough time to do everything that we want to do, and especially to do them as well as we'd like to do. But I think it's, especially if there's some kind of like specific decisions that have been made. A example would be that like you ended up like calling a function that limits the memory of a PHP process, because at that time there was an issue with the kind of how much memory the server had. But then over time, those memory issues disappeared. But do you have are you courageous enough to delete that line? Because it feels that it's put there in purpose. So kind of documenting the why of those kind of things in commit messages and code review, I think is a time well spent.
Nice. And then we have one more question here. When documenting things in Jira, when documenting things in Jira boards that are team specific and not shared between teams, how do we handle this?
what you mean by that. In my experience, the projects that I've worked in, you usually have a code base and a Jira board related to that. Especially when it comes to kind of finding out what was done and then going from the code into the Jira board. If the thing is about documenting things that the discussions might happen with a team that doesn't have access to it, you can just write those discussions down. I probably didn't answer your question, I'm sorry. We can maybe have a kind of a continuation discussion about that at the end as well.
So we have a follow-up here. I can follow up. We have a development team of 50 people split up in multiples, and we don't necessarily share the information across teams.
Yeah, I think that if there is information that influences your team should know about that. And it sounds like that if that's the case, if the teams are too siloed and too kind of separated from each other, even if there's some overlap in the business domain or things like that, I would do a retrospective between those teams and kind of drill deep into what is the information that's missing, what kind of problems is that causing, and how you can, as multiple teams, improve the situation of sharing the information. But it's more of it's not an easy challenge, let me say that. Organizational things are never easy. So figuring out maybe there's a way to have kind of like an extra added shared space where these teams can contribute with each other. Awesome. I think that was the questions. If some come up, we can also then take a look at them at the end. But I think now is a good time to continue with the meetup. Thanks for having me. I hope you all have a great week, and I hope that when the situation allows, I'll be able to come and visit the meetup in person as well.
Yeah, we look forward to have you in Stockholm, and thank you.